The Pioneer of Faith, a biography of Dr. Young Eun Kim, 1914 to 1996. Dr. Young Eun Kim stands as a monumental figure in the history of global religious movements, recognized primarily as the first missionary of the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity, widely known as the Unification Church. Her life was a unique synthesis of traditional Korean spirituality, rigorous Western liberal theological training, and radical commitment to a nascent, often persecuted, new religious movement. Her journey from a highly educated, established academic to a solitary missionary in 1950s America defined the initial encounter between the teachings of Reverend Sun Myung Moon and the Western world. Dr. Kim was not merely a messenger. She was the movement's first intellectual architect in the West, tasked with translating profound, complex, and culturally alien philosophical concepts into the language of Christian theology and contemporary academia. This biography traces the trajectory of her 82 years, examining her preparation, her monumental struggles, her intellectual contributions, and her enduring legacy as the pioneer who planted the first vital seed of unificationism on American soil. Part 1. Preparation and Search, 1914 to 1954. Early Life and Christian Foundations, 1914 to 1945. Young Eun Kim was born in 1914 in modern-day North Korea, during the harsh period of Japanese colonial rule. Her early environment was characterized by burgeoning Korean nationalism and deep traditional adherence to Presbyterian Christianity, which often served as a focal point for resistance to Japanese cultural assimilation. Kim's family background instilled in her a strong intellectual curiosity and deep faith. Unlike many women of her generation, her educational path was ambitious and international. She sought education not only within Korea but traveled to Japan to pursue higher studies during the 1930s. Her academic trajectory quickly demonstrated a focus on philosophy and religion, setting her on a path towards professional theological scholarship. The most formative period of her early life occurred during her years of study in North America. Driven by a desire for comprehensive theological training, she enrolled at the United Theological College in Montreal, Canada, followed by studies in the United States. During the 1940s, Kim received a master's degree, establishing herself as a promising, modern, and highly progressive theological thinker. Her education was rooted in the liberal Christian tradition, emphasizing the social gospel, critical biblical scholarship, and the need for Christianity to address global social and political problems. This training prepared her not for sectarian ministry, but for bridging cultural and religious divides. However, despite her academic success, Kim felt a profound spiritual and intellectual dissatisfaction. The liberal theology she mastered seemed intellectually sound but lacked the spiritual power or definitive answers needed to heal the fractured post-war world. She returned to Korea in the late 1940s, shortly before the Korean War, bringing with her a Western educational pedigree that few Koreans possessed, yet still searching for a faith capable of revolutionary transformation. The Korean Crucible and the Encounter, 1945 to 1954. The decade following her return was marked by intense national upheaval. Korea was ripped apart by ideological conflict, culminating in the devastating Korean War, 1950 to 1953. This period of chaos and spiritual crisis was the historical backdrop against which she encountered the teachings of the Reverend Sun Myung Moon. In the early 1950s, after the armistice, Kim was working as a professor in the turbulent environment of post-war South Korea. She was drawn to the nascent Christian renewal movements flourishing outside the established churches, which were sometimes called pockets of revival or groups focused on the Second Advent. In 1954, she officially encountered the teachings that would later be systematized as the divine principle. Reverend Moon had recently established the church in Seoul, though its initial followers were few and often marginalized or ostracized by the established Christian community. For Kim, the divine principle was not simply another sectarian interpretation. It was a systematic, philosophical answer to the theological voids she had experienced in her Western education. Specifically, she found compelling a coherent theodicy. The teachings offered a detailed, systematic explanation for the problem of evil and suffering that seemed more comprehensive than traditional Christian doctrines of original sin. Unity of purpose. It offered a universal framework for understanding history, uniting seemingly disparate biblical events into a single, progressive narrative leading toward a future ideal world, the kingdom of heaven on earth. Intellectual depth. Unlike many emotional revival movements, the principle satisfied her trained academic mind, offering structured laws such as principle of creation, principle of restoration that could be analyzed and debated. Her conversion was intensely intellectual, marking a commitment that transcended her established academic career. She recognized the profound implications of the teachings for global theology. By 1954, Dr. Kim, the liberal Christian scholar, had become Young Eun Kim, a dedicated disciple and, crucially, the movement's most articulate theologian capable of communicating its message to the West. Part 2. The Mission to the West, 1959 to 1965. The Call to America. By the late 1950s, after the movement had achieved a basic organizational structure in Korea, Reverend Moon identified the critical need to expand globally, starting with the United States. America, at the height of its Cold War dominance, was viewed as the ideological pivot point for the free world, making it the essential staging ground for the movement's global mission. In 1959, Dr. Young Eun Kim was chosen for this unprecedented, solitary task. Her qualifications were unique: flawless English, advanced Western theological training, and profound intellectual commitment to the divine principle. She was given the mandate to introduce unificationism to the West, armed with little more than her faith, a few personal savings, and handwritten notes on the core teachings. The gravity of this mission cannot be overstated. Korea was still reeling from the war, and the Unification Church was poor, suspected by the government, and denounced by mainstream churches. Kim's journey was the ultimate commitment. She left her home, cultural context, and academic standing for an unknown future. Solitary struggle in Oregon, 1959 to 1962. Dr. Kim landed in Eugene, Oregon in January 1959. The choice of location was strategic. It was far from the major theological centers, allowing her to establish a quiet foothold and develop the initial English terminology without immediate confrontation with the established religious institutions of New York or Los Angeles. However, her life there was one of intense hardship and deep loneliness. Kim arrived as a middle-aged Asian woman in a predominantly white, culturally conservative 1950s American town. She struggled initially with severe cultural isolation and poverty. To sustain herself, she took menial jobs while dedicating her free time to the overwhelming task of translation. Her most immediate and significant challenge was linguistic and philosophical translation. The core tenets of the divine principle utilize concepts derived from East Asian philosophy, Neo-Confucianism, and Korean shamanistic terminology, intertwined with unique biblical interpretations. There were no direct English equivalents for foundational concepts like Sung-sang, invisible substance, and Hyung-sang, visible form, or the precise meaning of Hyung-jin Nipso, the path of indemnity. Kim had to not only translate the words but create an entire theological lexicon in English, a process that required immense intellectual finesse to ensure that the esoteric meaning was preserved while being accessible to a Western, Christian-influenced audience. She began teaching the principle primarily to small, informal study groups, often in her meager apartment. Slowly, she attracted a handful of young, spiritually searching Americans, notably Dr. Moses Durst and others who would form the core leadership of the early American movement. The move to Berkeley and initial growth. Recognizing the need for a more dynamic intellectual environment, Dr. Kim moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in the early 1960s, settling near Berkeley, California. Berkeley, with its academic atmosphere and burgeoning countercultural movement, proved to be more fertile ground. By 1963, she had established the first official Unification Church Center in America, a modest house that served as a headquarters, dormitory, and lecture hall. Utilizing her scholarly skills, she began formalizing the translated text. The result was the first comprehensive English presentation of the theology, titled The Divine Principle, which was distributed in cyclostyled, mimeographed form. During this period, Kim operated as the movement's entire administrative, theological, and educational apparatus. She taught the 3-day and 7-day lectures, mentored the converts, and managed the daily life of the nascent community. Her intellectual rigor and calm scholarly demeanor provided a sense of legitimacy that counterbalanced the radical nature of the message she was delivering. Her early followers were drawn not just by the content, but by the intellectual integrity and personal sacrifice of the missionary herself. Part 3. The Theologian and Academic Pioneer, 1965 to 1985. Establishing Unification Theology. As the American movement grew through the 1960s, Dr. Kim continued her mission of bridging East and West. By the late 1960s, the movement had entered a new phase of organization and increasingly faced theological scrutiny. Kim understood that for unificationism to gain any acceptance in America, it needed to engage the intellectual establishment, not merely the counterculture. Her primary focus shifted from pioneering mission work to building a robust intellectual infrastructure. She dedicated herself to writing the definitive theological texts that explained unificationism using established Western philosophical and theological categories. Her most significant contributions in this era include Unification Theology and Christian Thought, 1975. This seminal work was perhaps her most critical achievement. It systematically compared the divine principle with major doctrines throughout Christian history, from the Council of Nicaea to modern liberal theology. By positioning unificationism as a culmination and resolution of historical Christian theological debates, she provided serious intellectual footing for a movement often dismissed as purely cultic. The Eternal Garden, 1972, and later works. These writings explored specific doctrines, Christology, eschatology, and the nature of God, demonstrating how unification principles offered unique solutions to long-standing theological paradoxes. Dr. Kim's methodology was crucial. She did not rely solely on faith or emotional appeals, but on rigorous, comparative theological analysis. She presented unificationism not as a replacement for Christianity, but as its fulfillment and expansion. The founding of UTS and academic legitimacy. The apex of her academic career coincided with the founding of the Unification Theological Seminary, UTS, in Barrytown, New York, in 1975. This institution was founded explicitly to train the movement's second generation of ministers and scholars and, critically, to engage the wider academic and religious worlds. Dr. Kim was appointed professor of systematic theology at UTS. Here, she cultivated an environment of serious academic inquiry. She trained hundreds of students, many of whom went on to earn PhDs from major Western universities, carrying the discourse of unificationism into mainstream academia. Her presence at UTS lent immediate intellectual credibility. She was not a minister but a trained academic who could speak the language of hermeneutics, Christology, and comparative religion fluently. She ensured that the study of the divine principle at UTS was conducted alongside required studies in Augustine, Aquinas, Barth, and Tillich, forcing an intellectual confrontation and synthesis rather than a simple sectarian recitation, navigating controversy and cultural gaps. The 1970s and 1980s were marked by intense public controversy regarding the Unification Church, often labeled pejoratively as Moonies. Dr. Kim faced the difficult challenge of defending the movement's theology and integrity against accusations of political manipulation, brainwashing, and economic exploitation. As the movement's chief intellectual representative in the West, she often engaged in public dialogue and scholarly forums, patiently explaining the theological motivations behind the movement's social activities. Her quiet authority and scholarly status often disarmed critics who expected a fanatical representative. She also played a delicate role within the internal structure of the movement. As the first missionary and a Western-educated scholar, she often served as a vital mediator between the highly centralized, culturally Korean leadership in Seoul and the independent, sometimes skeptical Western converts. She interpreted the cultural nuances of Reverend Moon's sermons and directions for a Western audience, while simultaneously articulating the intellectual needs and challenges of the American movement back to the Korean leadership. Part 4. Legacy and Final Years, 1985 to 1996. Continued scholarship and global outreach. In her later years, Dr. Kim continued to write prolifically and travel globally. She expanded her focus to include comparative religion, particularly the relationship between Unificationism and major world faiths beyond Christianity. Her work, Humanity's Universal Religion, 1990, explored the concept of a unifying monotheism that could serve as a common ground for global ethical action. She was instrumental in founding and advising various academic ancillary organizations associated with the unification movement, such as the Professors' World Peace Academy, PWPA, and the Religious Youth Service, RYS, ensuring that the movement's outreach was grounded in intellectual discourse and ethical principles. Despite her advanced age, she remained a lecturer and mentor, frequently visiting UTS and centers around the world, emphasizing the necessity of scholarly commitment alongside spiritual discipline. She never sought hierarchical power, preferring instead the role of the devoted scholar and teacher. The enduring pioneer. Dr. Young Eun Kim passed away in 1996. Her death marked the end of the foundational missionary era and the transition of Unificationism into a second generation of leadership. Her singular sacrifice and pioneering spirit set the precedent for the movement's global expansion. She demonstrated that Unificationism was not merely a spiritual phenomenon, but a serious intellectual system capable of engaging the most complex philosophical problems of the 20th century. The key elements of her enduring legacy are the following: the English theological lexicon. She created the language of unification theology in the West. Every scholar, missionary, and follower who utilizes terms like four-position foundation, original image, or Hoon Do Kui operates within the linguistic framework she painstakingly established in the 1960s. Intellectual legitimacy. By grounding the movement in comparative theology and rigorous academic standards, she provided the necessary intellectual ballast for the Church to endure massive public scrutiny and emerge as a faith that engages in global interreligious dialogue. The missionary ideal. Her initial decade of poverty, isolation, and unyielding dedication in Oregon and California established the model of missionary commitment within the Unification Church. A commitment to sacrifice one's personal comfort for the sake of the global dissemination of the message. Conclusion. The Bridge Builder. Dr. Young Eun Kim was a figure defined by transformation and pioneering vision. She moved from the rigidity of traditional Korean Christianity to the intellectual freedom of Western liberal theology, only to find her ultimate calling in the radical, emergent faith of Unificationism. Her biography is the story of a dual commitment. The commitment of the missionary who braved a strange land with no resources, and the commitment of the scholar who faced down the theological establishment with nothing but her intellect and a newly translated philosophy. As the first missionary of the Unification Church, Young Eun Kim's life was the foundational bridge, connecting the spiritual insights of Korea to the intellectual tradition of the West. Without her scholarly courage and personal sacrifice, the dissemination of the unification message in the West would have likely been delayed by decades, lacking the theological sophistication necessary to survive the intense scrutiny of the late 20th century. She remains, in the annals of the movement she helped establish globally, the pioneer par excellence. The quiet, brilliant intellectual who planted the first seed of a new faith in the soil of the American West.